On December 22, 1864, Abraham Lincoln sat in a cold, exhausted Washington, trying to hold together a country that had spent 3.5 years bleeding itself white. A telegraph operator walked into the War Department with a message from the Georgia coast, addressed to the president. It was short, almost casual. "I beg to present you, as a Christmas gift, the city of Savannah, with 150 heavy guns and plenty of ammunition, and also about 25,000 bales of cotton. Signed, Major General William Tecumseh Sherman." 4 days later, Lincoln wrote back. He thanked Sherman for the Christmas gift and admitted that when Sherman had cut loose from Atlanta and marched towards the Atlantic with no supply line, he had been anxious, if not fearful, and then added the line most people remember. "Now the undertaking being a success, the honor is all yours, for I believe none of us went farther than to acquiesce." That letter doesn't mention the blackened chimneys locals would call Sherman's sentinels. It doesn't mention the twisted lengths of iron called Sherman's neckties, railroad rails heated in bonfires and wrapped around trees so they could never be used again. And it doesn't mention the letters, private, unvarnished, sometimes shockingly blunt, in which Sherman explained what he was doing, why he was doing it, and what he believed war really was. For 160 years, people have called him many things. In the South, he was a monster and a barbarian, the man who made war on women and children. In the North, even some politicians muttered that he was unstable or insubordinate. Later in the war, after a political ambush in Washington, he became so disgusted that he refused to take the Secretary of War's hand in front of the entire Union Army. Sherman was not a sadist. He was something more unsettling. A soldier who stripped the romance from war and followed its logic farther than most people were prepared to go. He believed and said over and over that the surest way to end a war was to make it feel like all hell to the society sustaining it. He wasn't interested in slaughtering Confederate armies for its own sake. He wanted to break the South's ability and will to keep putting armies into the field. That's why Atlanta's rail yards and depots burned. That is why railroads were wrecked, mills demolished, and warehouses torched. It is also why his officers often argued amongst themselves about where hard war ended and simple looting began. The reality of the march to the sea was more controlled, more chaotic, and more morally complicated than either side's myth makes it. This is not the tidy story of a hero and his grateful government, and Sherman would have been the first to say so. A lot of behind-the-scenes work goes into every script, animation, and edit you see here. If you're enjoying the results, hit subscribe to join the journey. It's the best way to support the team. Also, dropping a like tells us exactly what kind of history you want to see next. Let's jump back in. He was born in Lancaster, Ohio, on February 8, 1820, and his father named him Tecumseh, after the Shawnee leader who had fought to hold his people's land against the United States. When his father died in 1829, leaving 9 children and almost no money, 9-year-old Tecumseh was taken in by a neighbor, Thomas Ewing, a rising Ohio politician who would become a U.S. Senator and Cabinet Secretary. Ewing gave the boy a room, an education, and a Catholic baptism that added William to the front of his name. Everyone in the family called him Cump. Almost no one called him William again. Cump went to West Point in 1836 and graduated 4 years later, 6th in a class of 43, sharp enough to mark him as one of the better minds of his cohort, but not the kind of golden boy who attracted instant fame. The Mexican War gave many classmates a chance to win laurels. Sherman spent most of it on staff and administrative duty in California, watching from the margins while other men's names appeared in dispatches. That sense of having missed something never quite left him. Peace did him no favors. In San Francisco, he managed a bank branch during the gold rush boom and bust, only to watch it fail in the Panic of 1857. A New York branch failed soon after. He tried law, hated it. He tried real estate, failed again. By 1860, 40 years old and still living in the shadow of other men's reputations, he had found something he seemed naturally suited for, running a military academy in Louisiana that would later become LSU. Then the state seceded. Surrounded by Southern colleagues he liked and students he had grown attached to, Sherman did not celebrate. He warned them, "You people of the South don't know what you're doing," he reportedly told one friend. "This country will be drenched in blood, and God only knows how it will end." But he knew what he was. He wasn't a politician. He was a soldier. So he resigned, went north, and offered his services to the government he believed would have to fight. His first combat came at First Bull Run, where he performed solidly but without glory. The real test came that fall when he was sent to Kentucky to command a critical border department. Sherman correctly saw that Confederate forces posed a serious threat and that the Union had far too few men to hold the line. His escalating requests for reinforcements, 60,000 men, then 100,000, then 200,000, were militarily defensible. But to Washington, they sounded like panic. Secretary of War Simon Cameron visited his headquarters, found a commander taut with anxiety, and left convinced Sherman was unstable. The story moved faster than any official order. On December 11, 1861, the Cincinnati Commercial ran a story branding him insane, splashing "Insane Sherman" across its coverage while he was still in command. He was still in command when they printed it. Relieved of command, Sherman went home to Lancaster and sat reading his own supposed madness in the papers. He later admitted in a letter to his wife Ellen that the humiliation drove him so low he thought of ending his life, and that only the thought of his children stopped him. His wife and powerful in-laws worked their Washington contacts to salvage his career. Ulysses S. Grant did more than that. He trusted him. Reassigned to the Western armies, Sherman took a division under Grant at Shiloh in April 1862. On the first day, he was shot in the hand, had multiple horses killed under him, and still held together the Union right while divisions around him buckled. When Grant counterattacked on the second day, Sherman's battered men went forward with him. Promotion to Major General followed. Sherman reportedly summed up the bond that formed between them this way: "Grant stood by me while I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk, and now we stand by each other." Both men knew what it was to be talked about behind their backs as unfit or dangerous. Both had been saved by others' confidence. Sherman never forgot who had pulled him back from the edge, and never forgot who had pushed him toward it. The Kentucky episode branded into him a permanent hatred of the press. After Shiloh, he watched correspondents turn rumor into fact and second-guess operations they only half understood. "I hate newspaper men," he raged. "They come into camp and pick up their camp rumors and print them as facts. I regard them as spies, which, in truth, they are." During the Vicksburg campaign, he even had a New York Herald reporter court-martialed and expelled others from his line, an almost unheard-of step at the time. That vow to never be accountable to newspaper opinion would shape everything he did later, including how he explained and refused to explain the fires of Atlanta and March to the Sea. For the first 2 years of the war, Sherman followed Washington's policy of conciliation. Win battles, protect property, treat Southern civilians with restraint, and trust that the rebellion would wither. He punished looting. He tried to keep his men out of private houses. Then he watched the war not end. In the East, McClellan won tactical victories on the peninsula and still retreated when Lee counterattacked. In the West, Donelson, Shiloh, Corinth, and Vicksburg did not produce a negotiated peace. Confederate guerrillas tore up tracks and ambushed trains while civilians along the routes fed them, sheltered them, and reported vulnerable points. With almost no consequences, paroled Confederates who went home found their farms intact, their railroads running, and their families fed, and then drifted back to the ranks. Nothing in their experience told them the war was unsustainable. By 1863, Sherman had concluded that the basic premise of conciliation was wrong. The Confederacy wasn't just an army, it was a mobilized society. As long as that society felt insulated, plantations shipping cotton, railroads moving food, towns humming along, it would keep producing soldiers. In September 1863, he put the new logic on paper in a long letter to Henry Halleck. "Every member of the nation," he wrote, "is bound by natural and constitutional law to maintain and defend the government against all its opposers whomsoever. If they fail to do it, they are derelict and can be punished or deprived of all advantages arising from the labors of those who do." The key word was deprived. Sherman was not proposing to shoot civilians. He was redefining what counted as legitimate targets. Every citizen owed a duty to the national government, then those who withheld that duty could justly be stripped of the material benefits of belonging to that nation. In the South, those advantages were railroads, mills, warehouses, granaries, cotton gins, and machine shops. The infrastructure that fed Confederate armies and connected fields to front lines. From that point on, he thought less like a man maneuvering against an opposing general and more like someone dissecting a living organism. Cut the nerves, crush the arteries, tear up the muscles. The sooner you did that, the sooner the creature would stop fighting. Modern theorists would call this a theory of war determination, to make war so terrible for the society sustaining it that the appetite for it dies for generations. In his own words, "We cannot change the hearts and minds of those people of the South, but we can make war so terrible and make them so sick of war that generations would pass away before they would again appeal to it." In early 1864, he ran a field test. The Meridian Campaign in central Mississippi set roughly 25,000 men to work for 5 days with axes, crowbars, sledges, and fire, tearing up track, bending rails, burning depots. Meridian, with its depots, storehouses, arsenal, hospitals, offices, hotels, and cantonments, no longer exists, he reported afterward. Civilians were left with enough food to survive. They were not left with an intact rail junction. From Meridian to Atlanta, and from Atlanta to the sea, the line was straight. The only thing that changed was scale. The clearest statement of this philosophy came after the march, in a letter to Halleck from Savannah on December 24, 1864. "I attach more importance to these deep incisions into the enemy's country," he wrote, "because this war differs from European wars in this particular. We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people. It must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war, as well as their organized armies." Then he described the effect of the march. "Thousands deceived by their line papers into the belief that we were being whipped all the time had now realized the truth and have no appetite for a repetition of the same experience." And then, in a line that shows how thin the ice was even for a man trying to think like a theorist, he left something raw surface. "The truth is, the whole army is burning with an insatiable desire to wreak vengeance upon South Carolina," he admitted. "I almost tremble at her fate, but feel that she deserves all that seems in store for her." He knew exactly what he had just written. On September 2nd, 1864, Atlanta fell. Sherman had inched toward it since May. 4 months of maneuver and fighting through North Georgia against Joseph E. Johnston's retreat and dig-in strategy, then a final series of assaults and flanking moves after Jefferson Davis replaced Johnston with the more aggressive John Bell Hood. When Hood's counterattacks failed and his army slipped away south, the city that had armed much of the Confederate West lay in Union hands. Sherman's first major decision as occupier was cold as it was practical. Atlanta would not be a normal occupied city. He had seen what it took to garrison Memphis, Vicksburg, and New Orleans. Whole divisions pinned down policing civilians and running city governments instead of fighting. In early September, he issued an order expelling the remaining civilian population. Atlanta, he told his superiors, would be a pure military garrison or depot, a fortified supply base for coming operations. On September 11th, Mayor James Calhoun and a group of city councilmen wrote a formal protest. They acknowledged Sherman's power to enforce the order, but pleaded with him to consider the aged, the sick, the females, and the children, who had nowhere to go and no way to endure a winter journey. Sherman's reply on September 12th has become one of the most famous letters of the Civil War. He began by saying he has read it carefully and give full credit to your statements of the distress that will be occasioned. Then immediately adds that he shall not revoke my orders because they were not designed to meet the humanities of the case, but to prepare for the future struggles in which millions of good people outside of Atlanta have a deep interest. I believe you, and it doesn't change a thing. Then came the line every textbook pulls out, where he tells them that war is cruelty and that you cannot refine it. and that those who brought war into the country deserve whatever curses their people can pour out. Taken alone, that sounds like pure vengeance, but the paragraphs around it show something more complex. I know I had no hand in making this war, and I know I will make more sacrifices today than any of you to secure peace. He reminds them that they had supported secession. He had opposed it. They had voted for the government that chose war. He had warned them what it would cost. But you cannot have peace and division of our country. If the United States submits to a division now, it'll not stop, but will go on until we recap the fate of Mexico, which is eternal war. At the end of the letter is a passage almost no one quotes because it doesn't fit the caricature. But, my dear sirs, when peace does come, you may call on me for anything. Then I will share with you the last cracker and watch with you to shield your homes and families against danger from every quarter. He is not offering sentiment. He is telling them in his attitude towards them depends entirely on whether they are at war with the government or at peace with it. 2 months later, with the evacuation complete and his army preparing to march, Sherman issued the orders that would sear his name into Southern memory. The railroads, depots, machine shops, foundries, arsenals, and warehouses that made Atlanta a logistics hub were to be destroyed. He also specifically directed that churches and most private dwellings be spared. What happened next was part plan, part physics, and part human nature. Fires set in depots jumped to nearby blocks. Troops did some unauthorized burning. On the ground, that combination meant flames that ate through the railroad district and leapt into mixed neighborhoods until it was impossible to tell which fires were deliberate and which were accidents. In the end, estimates suggest roughly a third of the city was destroyed, far more than Sherman had intended on paper, but far short of the total destruction later Southern memory would claim. The rail yards, warehouses, and industrial district were gutted. Many churches still stood. Major Henry Hitchcock of Sherman's staff, watching the glow from headquarters that night, wrote in his diary that General S. will hereby be charged with indiscriminate burning. Entire residential neighborhoods survived relatively intact. On November 15, 1864, about 62,000 Union soldiers stepped off from Atlanta in 4 columns and began moving southeast through Georgia. Behind them, telegraph wires were cut. Ahead of them, there was no supply line and no clear destination that anyone outside Sherman's inner circle could name with certainty. John Bell Hood was marching north into Tennessee to threaten Union communications. Sherman did not chase him. He left George Thomas to deal with Hood and pointed his own army toward the Atlantic. Before they left, Sherman issued Special Field Orders, number 120. The army would forage liberally on the country for food and fodder. Each brigade would send organized foraging parties under officers. Those parties were forbidden to enter private homes, instructed to avoid threatening language, and directed to leave each family enough food for its own survival. Destruction of structures was reserved to corps commanders alone and was to be carried out only in areas where guerrillas or civilians actively resisted the march. On paper, it was a hard war campaign aimed at infrastructure, not people. In practice, there was a gap, as there always is, between written orders and what hundreds of small groups of hungry, cold, angry, and unsupervised men actually did. The Army produced its own unofficial raiding class, the Bummers. These were loose bands of foragers, some officially detailed, some not, who ranged ahead of the main columns, stripped farms and plantations of livestock and corn, and took anything else portable. Many followed the broad outlines of Sherman's orders. Others went well beyond them, breaking into houses, stealing personal valuables, and setting unauthorized fires. Sherman later acknowledged in his memoirs that some did things they ought not to have done. What the march did not do is as important as what it did. Modern research suggests Confederate civilian deaths directly attributable to the march were comparatively low by the standards of 19th century warfare, though the evidence is incomplete and debated. Most private homes in Georgia were not burned. Most families were not physically harmed. The systematic targets were military and economic. Roughly 285 miles of route covered, hundreds of miles of railroad torn up, rails heated and twisted into Sherman's neckties, bridges destroyed, depots burned, and cotton gins and mills wrecked, along with hundreds of thousands of pounds of stored food seized or rendered useless to Confederate armies. Chief Engineer Colonel Orlando Poe designed tools specifically to make uprooting and bending rails more efficient, making systematic rail destruction a planned industrial operation, not an improvised act of revenge. For many Southerners, the deeper wound was psychological. Confederate armies could not protect their own people. Accounts from Confederate soldiers in Virginia described letters from home. Sherman's men had been there and left nothing. Men who might have stayed in the ranks with abstract talk of honor found themselves picturing their families facing foragers with no cavalry between them. Desertions rose. This was exactly the effect Sherman had predicted to Halleck from Savannah. Thousands, deceived by their lie on newspapers, had now seen Union columns on their own roads and smoke from their own depots, and had no appetite for a repetition of the same experience. The empty smokehouse made an argument no newspaper could answer. Savannah, when Sherman reached it in December, illustrated the other half of its policy. Confederate General William Hardee slipped his garrison out through the swamps rather than fight house to house. On December 21st, Savannah's mayor formally surrendered. Sherman's army marched in without a street battle, left the city's famed squares and architecture largely untouched, and reopened the port under Union control. There was no Atlanta-style burning. Savannah had, in Sherman's eyes, behaved as a sensible city in a lost cause should have. From there came the famous telegram, the Christmas gift of Savannah to Lincoln. Sherman spent almost no time basking. His follow-up letter outlined the next moves, north through the Carolinas toward South Carolina, the cradle of secession, and the real test of everything he had built his theory on. Sherman tried to end the war the same way he had fought it, fast, total, and destructive, and it nearly destroyed him. On April 9, 1865, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox. News reached Sherman in North Carolina 3 days later. He sent Grant a wire that morning saying that if Johnston follows Lee's example, I shall, of course, grant the same terms. When Sherman and Johnston met at James Bennett's farmhouse near Durham Station on April 17th, Johnston indicated he might be able to secure the surrender not only of his own army, but of all remaining Confederate forces, if the right political terms could be offered. Sherman, who had spent 4 years watching men die by the thousands, found the prospect of a single document to end the war everywhere irresistible. Without consulting Washington, he drafted terms. Those terms went far beyond Appomattox. They provided for an armistice, recognition of existing state governments, disbanding of armies with weapons deposited in state arsenals, restoration of political and civil rights, and a general amnesty, sketching a soft landing for the Confederacy back into the Union, with white Southern elites largely left in place. They did not explicitly safeguard the Emancipation Proclamation or the framework of Reconstruction Congress was already envisioning. Jefferson Davis, on the run, accepted at once. When the agreement arrived in Washington, Grant read it and went pale. Edwin Stanton went to the newspapers. On April 24th, the New York Times published the text and condemned it as so generous that, as one critic put it, you were at a loss to know which side had agreed to surrender. Rumors flew that Sherman had been bribed with Confederate gold to help Jefferson Davis escape. The Chicago Tribune reached for an old insult and called his behavior evidence of stark insanity. Stanton did worse in private. He authorized Henry Halleck to telegraph Union generals in the field instructing them to pay no regard to any truce or orders of General Sherman. While Sherman's army still sat under a ceasefire he believed legitimate, Sherman learned about it from the newspapers. Grant was dispatched quietly to North Carolina to clean up the mess. He explained that Washington had rejected the political terms and instructed Sherman to offer Johnston exactly what Lee had received. Nothing more. Sherman, from being one of the most popular generals of the land, was denounced by the President and Secretary of War in very bitter terms. Grant later wrote, "Some people went so far as to denounce him as a traitor, a most preposterous term to apply to a man who had rendered such conspicuous service." Sherman swallowed it and did what he was told. On April 26th, Johnston surrendered on strictly military terms. The tally was staggering. 89,270 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms, more than triple Lee's numbers at Appomattox, the largest single surrender of Confederate forces in the war. Then the fury hit. In a letter to Stanton, dated April 25th, he told him, in effect, that he believed the government had made a mistake, but that he would not make it his business to fight them on it. Translation? You bungled a chance to end this war cleanly, and I will not be your scapegoat. The final insult came in public. In May 1865, at the Grand Review in Washington, the Union's two-day victory parade down Pennsylvania Avenue, Sherman went up to join the dignitaries on the reviewing stand. There, in front of his soldiers and the watching crowds, he deliberately refused to take Stanton's outstretched hand. Grant, standing beside them, later wrote that Sherman did it deliberately and ostentatiously, a silent verdict on the man who had effectively called him a traitor in the middle of his own victory. For the rest of his life, he tried to make sure no one mistook his military success for an endorsement of war itself. He turned down presidential talk with the line, "If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve." On June 19, 1879, speaking to the graduating class of the Michigan Military Academy, he looked out at faces eager for glory and cut straight through their illusions. "I've been where you are now, and I will know just how you feel. It's entirely natural that there should beat in the breast of every one of you a hope and desire that someday you can use the skill you have acquired here. Suppress it. You don't know the horrible aspects of war, I tell you. War is hell." History shortened that to 3 punchy words: war is hell, and lost the part that mattered to him most. He was talking directly to young men who thought they wanted what he had lived through, trying to make them feel the weight of it before they ever put on a uniform. The harder question has never been legal. It is moral. Sherman believed and wrote long before his men left Atlanta that a short, hard campaign wrecking 300 miles of track and depots was more humane than 3 more years of polite battles that left Southern farms untouched while young men died in piles. Every additional month of conciliation that failed to end the war cost more lives than a season of tearing up railroads. Civilians who raised regiments fed them and cheered their departures were not neutral bystanders. "We are not only fighting hostile armies, but a hostile people," he told Halleck, "and must make old and young, rich and poor, feel the hard hand of war." If they were helping sustain the rebellion, they had to feel what sustaining it meant. Within 5 months of Sherman's entry into Savannah, every major Confederate army had surrendered. Historians still debate how much the march to the sea caused that collapse, how much it accelerated a fall already certain, and how much it simply coincided with other fatal blows from Grant in Virginia. What is harder to argue with is the specific predictions Sherman made to Halleck. Thousands of Southerners would, once they saw Union columns on their own roads and smoke from their own depots, have no appetite for a repetition of the same experience. In letter after letter from the Confederate front, that is what their soldiers described hearing from home. The man Northern papers called insane in 1861, a monster in 1864, and a near traitor in 1865, spent the last years of his life standing in front of boys who wanted glory and telling them, with the full weight of Atlanta at his back, that it was hell. He never pretended any of it was clean. He also never backed away from the argument that it had been necessary. That is not the psychology of a man who delights in destruction. It is the psychology of someone who looked, without flinching, at what winning a modern civil war actually required, and then spent the rest of his life warning the next generation not to romanticize what they hadn't seen. If you liked this video, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon.